the little red light will come on to show that you're actually talking. And you'll also see a little red button actually right next to the talk. The other piece of this is you can only have 8 microphones on at a time. So if you're talking, go ahead and talk, but once you're done talking, please just turn your microphone off and we'll move on to that. Pretty simple.
What is the 1-2?
So you're on
The 1-2 is a channel. We don't have any channels set up, so if you push that, it's not going to do anything. It won't mess it up. So you're good.
Okay, then.
You're
Now
right.
that I know it needs to be on for it to project. Okay. What are orders? Okay, introductions. Very good. Michelle Day, citizen at large.
Sharon Brown, represents City of Town.
Terry Hayes, Monument. Courtney Stone, Citizen at Large.
Juliet, League of Women Voters.
Tamara Dipner, City of Colorado Springs.
Al Moffett, El Paso County.
Kim Muchler, Citizen at Large.
Roy Rosenthal, Manitou Springs.
Ann Esch, Green Mountain Falls. I'm not really voted in yet, I don't think, but I'm here.
Aubrey Day, citizen at large.
Tim O'Donnell, Kono.
Jen Allen Girl, Pasco County.
Well, you just turned me off. Well, it shows me.
And back over there, please.
I'm Jenny Lyons, PPACG. Jennifer Valentine, PPACG staff.
Jessica Bechtel, PPACG.
And then in the audience, please.
Sharon Cordovano, Chamber of PDC.
Thank you.
Michelle Furrow.
Excellent.
James.
Thank you. Okay, so we have the consent items. If there's no discussion, can I have a motion?
When that means it's on. And then
Anybody?
so moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Are there any public comments? All right, seeing none, let's move on to our action items. We have, the first one is a membership appointment. All right. Getting on to it. There we go. City of Green Mountain Falls would like to appoint Ann Esch. Is anybody from PPACG going to present these, or is that me?
I believe it's okay for you to say.
Okay, that's fine by me, just making sure. Okay, and City of Manitou Springs is not, it's actually the PP, oh, okay. So, Green Mountain Falls, all right. Any questions on the membership appointment for Green Mountain Falls? Okay.
I move approval of the membership appointments as submitted.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. And then the second one is for the citizen at large, 2 citizen at large seats. Courtney Stone is seeking reappointment, and then we're going to have a vacancy. So let's deal with the reappointment for Courtney first. I'll second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. We need a nominating committee for the open...
Michelle,
I'm sorry.
quick follow-up. The proposed motion included selecting a nominating committee of 3.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going there? Okay.
Thank you. It's okay. I wanted to deal one piece at a time. The at-large, there's an open at-large seat. So we're going to need a nominating committee. Is anybody interested in chairing that or being part of the committee?
I'm happy to be a part of the committee.
Okay, Ellen?
Yes, I'll be a part of the committee.
Okay, so I've got 2 parts. Any chairs?
I can share it.
Okay. All right. Ellen. All right. Do we have to vote on the nominating committee members normally? No. Okay. All right. Jim, then you'll be in charge of scheduling time to get together. We don't even have applicants, do we? No? Okay. So then, once we have applicants, Jim will get in touch with you, too, about getting together and reviewing those. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Information items. Small area forecast. Jennifer, you're up.
Okay, good afternoon. Jennifer Valentine. I'm a transportation planner with PPACG. So last month, for those of you who were here, you should recall I gave a pretty detailed presentation about mostly the methodology and assumptions that we've been using, a lot of the detailed inputs that we're using for our land use model, Urban Sim. So this month, I'd really just like to focus on the changes we've made over the past month. So we did get some feedback at the April TAC and CAC meeting, so I'm just going to quickly run through the feedback we received and how we responded to it. So the first request was to share our base year data. So the model starts running in 2015, and our forecast year goes out to 2045. So people wanted to be able to very specifically compare what was happening between our base year and our forecast year. So I did send out a KMZ, which is the type of file you can open in Google Earth, and shape files, which for those of you who use GIS, that's what you would open there. So I sent those to the CAC per their request towards the end of April. Same with, we had a request to share all of our meeting notes from the meetings we had with land use planners, from our member governments, our military representatives, and we had a small team of economic experts who reviewed the forecast methodology and draft output. So the TAC was interested in seeing all of those. I believe they were included as attachment 4 in your packet, so you've seen those as well. We had another request to kind of revisit the classifications we were using for residential density. We opted not to do that just because we wanted to be able to compare sort of our maps from the very beginning of this process with the maps that we're producing now, and we also didn't want to lose. There was a request to kind of collapse some of the categories, but we didn't want to lose that detail. We had a few additional development projects down in Fountain that we just hadn't received yet. So as soon as we received them, we incorporated those into the model. We continued to refine and update our numbers about military employment and those living on the military installations. So we have really good up-to-date numbers for all of our installations now. And then probably the most substantial comment we received, especially at the TAC, was that the mask, if you recall the mask structure we were using, for infill, we started out with incorporated areas just as a starting point. And someone pointed out to us that, and I'll skip ahead here, so based on our land use scenarios that were developed through our public process and approved, recommended by our committees and approved by the board, so infill is defined as new development is concentrated in, quote, already developed areas. And so that's a little bit ambiguous, but it was the case that some of the areas that were not under the mask were not already developed, and some of the areas that were under the mask were already developed. So basically we just needed to tweak that infill mask a little bit based on what was already on the ground, essentially. And so that was the first thing. That was the first change we made to the infill mask, and there were others, though. So another thing we did, so last time the maps we presented to you basically just had densities. So it had that really dark green, and then you saw the reds and the oranges and the yellows. So we've kind of switched over to using these change maps where you can see gains and losses. And so, again, it goes back to comparing 2045 and 2015, so you can really see the changes between the base year and the forecast year. So another thing we did, all along we've been using these masks to try to help create 3 distinct land use scenarios, like I said, that were developed through our public process. We needed multiple tools to be able to do that, and one of those was the masks. So we had to play around with the strength of the masks. Was it a 50% mask, an 80% mask, 100% mask? So that's another thing we've been doing. So we increased the maximum allowable density of residential units or dwelling units in downtown Colorado Springs because, so we have several different areas that we're calling kind of our sanity checks, and downtown Colorado Springs is one of those because, working with our different member entities, some but not all have specific ideas about when and how they're going to grow. And so we've been working a lot with, Carl Schuler at the City of Colorado Springs, and we just weren't seeing quite as much growth, especially as you might expect in the infill scenario in the downtown area. So we figured we would at least set the maximum allowable a little bit higher and just see what the model wanted to do with basically with the market. I'll, I guess, ruin the punchline here. It didn't have much of an effect because I think we were kind of already maxed out. So we received a set of written comments from El Paso County staff, and the next few pieces refer to that. So one piece was kind of like with Fountain, there were a few additional development projects for Falcon that we needed to put in to really help. I mean, obviously that's a fast-growing area, and so for the model to really know that that's a fast-growing area, it either needs to see a lot on the ground and or a lot happening in the next 5 to 10 years. So putting in those development projects helped create a more kind of realistic trajectory for that area. I'm going to skip over this one. Okay, so back to the infill mask. So a comment we received from the county that actually I think turned out to be really, really important was not only at first were we a little bit off and needed to tweak kind of those already developed areas, but we were reminded that we had this, I don't know if you guys will remember it, this 2015 population and employment boundary. So it was, we had it up on the screen. It was kind of a blue blob. We ended up drawing lines out to Schriever, up 24, up to Falcon. So it was defined as 1,000 people and or jobs per square mile. So when we were developing all of the tools in Urban Sim, the timing was kind of off. We were going through the process of developing our goals, objectives, targets, scoring criteria. That was happening after we had already developed the mask, after we were already well into all of this in Urban Sim. So we had to come up with something on our own. Kind of come full circle, now the scoring criteria and everything has been approved. So we essentially have a board-approved definition of infill, that 1,000 people and or jobs per square mile, the blue blob with the roads out to Schriever, et cetera. And so we thought, for the sake of consistency, why don't we use that, or why don't we at least consider using that? So here we go. So this is the infill mask you saw last month. So the first tweak we wanted to make was just opening up a little bit here and up here where there was clearly already quite a bit of development on the ground. So you can kind of see opens up here and down here. But then the next thing we did was, so we had to do kind of the inverse of the 2015 population employment boundary. So that's what this is. And I'll show it to you in Google Earth in a minute, but if you toggle back and forth, you can kind of see that the main thing that happens is areas kind of on the east side of Colorado Springs get filled in, which, the 1,000 people and or jobs per square mile provides a pretty set definition of the density, where to draw the line. So it takes that subjectivity out of it, that you don't have to kind of squint and say, how many houses are in here? Does this look, quote, already developed? So we felt pretty good about the change of using this boundary instead. So we've incorporated it into our latest runs.
Could you just
describe each picture and what we're looking at? Because obviously there's big differences with what are the pictures. Again, for me, I'm sorry.
Sure. No, that's okay. So, so this is the infill mask that we use when we run the model. So there's the infill mask and the new centers mask, and then the dispersed development scenario doesn't use any mask. Actually, what I'm going to do, I think maybe Tamara last time requested to see an overview of kind of the assumptions and for each scenario. So maybe this will help a little bit, and if not, I'll come back to the picture of the mask. So basically, we have a couple of tools available. You can set how many dwelling units or how many, it's called floor area ratio, basically how many dwelling units or how many jobs are allowed in a specific type of area. So that's based on the zoning. So that's one of our tools. But what's allowed is different from what's actually marketable or what the model would put in an area. So just saying that you can put 100 dwelling units per acre doesn't mean that the model's going to put that many there. So we needed another tool to develop these 3 land use scenarios within Urban Sim. So we came up with this concept of the masks. So when you're looking at this mask, and so what we've used for our latest set of runs is 80%. So if there's so if this area right here was zoned low-density residential, that means that you can have up to 5 dwelling units per acre, so up to 5 houses on an acre. If this, because this is within the mask whole, so if this area right here, which is underneath the mask, was also low-density residential, now I'm going to have to do the mask. It was easier with 50 and 100, was also, say this was medium-density residential, say it was 10 dwelling units per acre, because it's under this mask, you can only receive, so it's the opposite, so you can only receive 20% of allowable zoning, so you could essentially only receive 2 dwelling units per acre. So it's a way to encourage the model to concentrate development in the whole areas.
What is the other slide? Show the other slide, because there's lots of differences there. What is the distinction that we're looking at?
Okay.
Scale of the picture, or is there actual changes?
Right. So the first picture, this was based on, we started out just with incorporated areas. So Woodland Park as a whole, obviously City of Colorado Springs as a whole. And then we ended up adding to it because there, like I said, there were areas under the mask that were already developed. So it was essentially incorporated areas plus a few additional already developed areas. This it's a relatively similar boundary in most places. You still see the whole up to Woodland Park, up to Monument.
The reason to Colorado Springs is the change.
Correct. So the main change is that, I guess the big one we can talk about is Banning Lewis Ranch. So Banning Lewis Ranch, there's kind of villages 1 and 2 happening, but for the most part is not already developed. Even people from the city who work for the City of Colorado Springs will disagree about whether Banning Lewis should be considered infill or not. We had that discussion with the board when we were coming up with this for the scoring criteria purposes. But basically, this is just anything that's in the hole that you can see through this area has 1,000 people and/or jobs per square mile or more. That's it. That's the definition of this.
So the light blue is below that standard.
Correct. Less dense than that. Okay.
So basically, you've taken Banning Lewis out, certainly the southern portions of Banning Lewis out.
Right. Not specifically, but because it's not developed, yes. Any grassland, dirt, just nothing there, it's not going to be in the mask hole because it's not developed.
And this is only for the infill side.
Correct. Okay.
I have one more question, I'm sorry.
Okay.
You want to turn on your mic?
Areas like Falcon or Baptist Road, are those good examples of new centers? Or at least if you were looking 3 years ago and looking forward, they would be new centers as we're defining them?
Yep. good segue to the next slide. So basically, initially, the distinction between the infill scenario and new centers was, so we started out with incorporated areas only for infill. I talked about how we changed that. But then for new centers, we added census designated places, which included, Falcon, Black Forest, a handful of others, and areas that were zoned PUD or planned unit development. It's what a lot of subdivisions are zoned, and so that's where you expect to see a lot of the new future growth. So yeah, we end up with a lot of additional holes. Falcon, Ellicott is really huge. I hear that there's going to be a town center thing there at some point. But yeah, you can just see a lot of these census designated places that get opened up. There's a little bit bigger Cascade, Chipeta Park, or Chipeta Falls. I don't remember which one it's called. That's a census designated place, and there actually is, a decent amount of residential development through here. But yeah, so it was supposed to give the model an opportunity or sort of a little push to develop some new centers. When you start looking at the results, it's not so much like there's a whole new city out here, but you do see changes in the way development's happening. You see a lot more development kind of to the north and the south of the core of the region. Okay, I think that was the main piece. And then dispersed is pretty straightforward. We didn't use a mask, and we assumed that current zoning classifications would remain out into the future. So it's kind of just like a trends continue scenario. So if you look at dispersed development, if you compare 2015 and 2045, it's, that's kind of like the let it ride scenario. Okay, are there other questions before I move on? Okay, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So we did a few what we were calling sanity checks because I thought Woodland Park was a great example because we talked to land use planners from Woodland Park, Sally and Lauren and Ben while he was still there, and they're pretty set on the fact that their build out is 12,600 based on water and land availability, and so depending on the scenario, we don't have huge differences between the scenarios, but they're kind of between 12 and 18% if you compare usually dispersed and infill, which we thought was a pretty good difference. I mean, we don't want them to be so drastic that it's not realistic for this region. But anyway, so we were really close on Woodland Park. You wouldn't necessarily expect them to be completely built out by 2045, maybe not.
Hi. I've just joined up with this group, and I'm from Green Mountain Falls, and I just don't see anything that you're doing about Green Mountain Falls yet. Is that sort of a new thing, or?
What do you mean by a new thing?
Well, we're between Cascade and Woodland Park, and the population and what's going on there. Mm-hmm. I just didn't see our name.
Yeah, so we have been working. I mean, we've been working with people from each entity. I think it was Dick Bratton. Yeah,
I noticed Dick Bratton, who is he's on the board of trustees still, that he's named, but I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. I guess.
Right.
Go
okay.
back and tell them.
Yeah. So there wasn't a lot of input for Green Mountain Falls because we did work with him, and he said there weren't any significant development projects kind of in the pipeline, so you're not necessarily expecting, a new residential development or a new shopping center or something like that to go in. So we didn't have any of that to put in. So one thing we're looking at, so Green Mountain Falls is such a small area geographically that we use TAZs, or Transportation Analysis Zones. That's our, basically when you look at those, the output maps, that's what those blobs are. And so because Green Mountain Falls is so small, it's only in kind of 1.5 TAZs. And so we actually we can get block level output from the model. We have almost 800 TAZs in our region, so I think there's like 80,000 or more blocks, so it's kind of unwieldy. But what we've talked about doing for our next forecast is to drill in and use those block level results for some of the smaller areas. And I know Green Mountain Falls is also in the process or about to update their comprehensive plan. So we've been talking, it's not me talking to them, but someone else in our office has been talking to them about how we can help with that. So it's possible that some of the output from this model could be used to help update your comp plan.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure.
Now do I turn it on?
Okay, so pretty happy to see that we're relatively close on Woodland Park. We wouldn't want to see it, 20,000 or something like that. So Banning Lewis was a big one to look at. So I looked at a couple of different things. We wanted to make sure there was some difference between the land use scenarios. So like I said, there was a 13% difference. It comes down to about 5,000 dwelling units. And so looking at how much of the region's new growth it's capturing, it's 31%, varies a little bit depending on the scenario, of new houses built between now and 2045. So I think it's something like 140,000 new houses expected to be built in that time period, and Banning Lewis is almost a third of them. It's a pretty big chunk of land, so it kind of made sense to us. I'm going to skip the DDA area for a second because Fountain is another area that's seeing a lot of growth, and so we thought, well, how is Fountain comparing to Banning Lewis? So the difference between the two is that there are already a lot of houses in Fountain, and there aren't really that many in Banning Lewis. So both are going to see a lot of growth, but Fountain is not quite as much because it's already kind of on that upward trajectory. If that makes sense.
In those two areas, that represents 50% of all new residential.
That's right. I think probably the majority of the others. I mean, you see, so the DDA area is just an area that the City of Colorado Springs outlines for certain, downtown planning activities. So that's between 2,500 and 2,900 new units, and that's only 2% of the region's new growth. So, I mean, you see some pretty good, apartment buildings, really contributing to our skyline for the first time in a long time, but even that is only 2%. So I think the rest is, in addition to some pretty large development projects, there's one or two up near Monument. There's a lot in El Paso County. Obviously, there's some that are like 5,000 units in one development, but then everything else is just kind of scattered across the region.
What does the model assume from an economic standpoint? There's always booms and busts. You never know. Banning Lewis ranches sit there empty for a long time. If the economy tanks, it could sit there empty for a long time. So just wondering, how does the model deal with that? Does it just look historically over a certain number of years, or what?
Yeah, so we use what we call control totals. So we have a control total for jobs and a control total for population, which you just use a multiplier. It's about 2.4 people living in every house in our region. So that comes from the state demographer's office. So we use their projections. We always have. She's always been, and I say she because it's, really, really close on the projections. So every year, so it's an annual process. The model respects that control total. So if the control total says we're going to grow by 6% or 8%, then that's what the model does. So it doesn't really play what if with the economy, basically.
Okay.
Yeah. It'll be fun though.
Were you expecting a greater difference? The scenarios, more than 14%?
I don't know if I was expecting a greater difference. I probably was wanting a greater difference. I think initially when I envisioned what the output maps were going to look like, it was like infill, disperse, and then new centers, because that's how it was envisioned through the public process. But the reality of the model and kind of the cruise ship analogy of the direction we're going, entering in all of these development projects that are going to be happening in the next 5 or 10 years, we're already kind of set in a direction, and so the scenarios are just veering off a little bit in either direction. So I've kind of come to terms with it. Again, it would be more fun if they were more drastic, but I think it's more realistic the way it is, that it's kind of variations on a theme for our region. Okay, so quickly, that was a good segue to this slide. So again, the whole cruise ship analogy, it was difficult to create three really distinct scenarios, but we maxed out all of the tools we had available. Again, I think it was really just that trajectory we're on with these big development projects that are already in the pipeline. So yeah, encouraging the model to develop new activity centers, especially that were not contiguous to existing growth, was really challenging because it just didn't want to do it. You know, there's efficiencies to using existing infrastructure or kind of connecting and growing at least a little bit contiguous. Okay, so the biggest thing on the wish list for next time is this Proforma model, which basically would mean that we would have a way to incentivize different areas within the mask hole. So right now we have this one big blob hole for infill, and everything within the hole gets treated the same. It would be really nice to be able to say, well, what about what about Academy, or what about North or South Nevada, or places where there are specific incentives in place. If you had something like a Proforma model, you'd be able to do that. It's just a more advanced tool that we're begging our consultant team to incorporate into this version of the model. Okay, so this is just kind of a data challenge that our base year data is 2015, and now we're halfway through 2018, and so we had to kind of attempt to make up for everything that's happened between 2015 and now. So basically I had to enter in a whole lot of development projects of things that have been built in the past couple of years, which was not ideal, but we got it done. And then finally, just it's always kind of difficult to get good employment data. So our population data all comes from the census, which is pretty reliable, even if not updated as often as we'd like. But the employment data is something you have to purchase. It's pretty expensive. It's updated pretty often, but there's always some error. So it's just another thing that we live with. Okay, so like I said, we did switch gears a little bit this time around. We wanted to really show you those differences between 2015 and 2045. We have also still been producing the density maps, so you can continue to compare things as we tweak the model. Before I switch over to Google Earth and toggle around in there for a minute, just schedule-wise, so this week we are doing what's called travel model integration. It's where this land use model talks to our travel model, and that's the final step we do. So we're getting pretty close to having to have stuff for our next board mail out, for our next TAC mail out. So right now we're working on what's hopefully kind of the final set of changes, but we don't expect to see big changes from the maps that I'll show you today. And then you have the schedule in your memo, so I won't read through that. And here's maybe a little better way for you to be able to see the differences between the two infill masks. Maybe it's the same. So this is the old one, and then this is the new one with. So the only places that the new infill mask is bigger is you get part of Fort Carson there and Schriever, because obviously they are major employment centers, and so they popped up. And then these little road connections out to those employment centers and up to Falcon, kind of providing these connections in here. But what I would like to do, and I don't know how many of you, humor me, show of hands, how many of you were able to open the KMZs or are able to use Google Earth? Yes? Was it fun? Okay. All right, so
Pretty heavy.
Google
There's a
Earth.
lot of resources.
Oh, yeah, slows things down, yeah. Okay, so what I kind of like to do, and this is one way you can start seeing those differences between the scenarios. So quickly, green is any TAS that grew between 2015 and 2045. In this case, we're looking at residential units, houses, population, however you want to think of it. We did cheat a little bit, and it's plus or minus 5, because we had some huge TASs out here that like lost one person or one job, and so it was this huge blue square, and we thought, okay, let's tone this down a little bit. So the gray is no change, and then the blue, not much blue here, is a loss. For the most part, because we do expect quite a bit of population and residential unit growth in our forecast period, you don't see losses in many places. Almost everything is growing. But what I kind of like to do is just toggle back and forth between, if I can find it. Okay. So you do start to see some differences. So this is dispersed, infill, dispersed, infill, dispersed, infill. So you see less growth on some of those fringe areas, which is kind of what you would expect. But again, if you click on it, well, I can't really see it, but I think it's 10, 16, something like that. So it's not a huge change, but you still kind of get the general picture for the region. And then new centers, kind of similar. I mean, you see less growth on the fringes, but it's also kind of interesting to see the growth or the differences between. That one's a little bit more subtle. So infill, new centers, infill, new centers. So we really saw much more dramatic differences when you start looking at jobs for a number of reasons. I think a big piece of it, like I said, is just that there's so much population, so many houses to go around that it kind of just wants to put them everywhere. Whereas with jobs, it's a little bit more concentrated. So dispersed jobs and then infill. So you really see a more dramatic kind of. It's much more condensed under the infill scenario, which is really what you would expect kind of with the mask. So the infill jobs looks a lot like the infill mask, so dispersed and infill. And then new centers is kind of interesting too, so dispersed, yes, this is jobs. So dispersed, new centers, dispersed, new centers. So you see more growth kind of up to the north and a little bit to the south. And then if you compare infill and new centers, you definitely see a lot more kind of to the north and a little bit to the south. So we don't get fun new cities anywhere, but we do see different development patterns based on really the masks and the underlying zoning that we specified. I'm not the chair.
Sorry. I wanted to ask about, if you're not using any economic data, are you using, when you use employment data, are you looking at average salaries? Because doesn't that necessarily influence where they might live?
Yeah, so, well, a couple pieces you hit on. So one is there's a lot more data behind the model than kind of what you see here. Every job sector is represented, so we could in the future go in and specify different growth rates for different job sectors. If we knew that, mining or tech or whatever was really expected to take off in our region, we could grow that faster than everything else. For now, because it's based on the control total from the state demographer, all of the job sectors are kind of growing at the same rate. But in terms of the income piece and where people are going to live, so it's a pretty rich data set because it is calibrated back to the 2010 census. So, I mean, we could farm out information about, we already have output about $9,000 to $13,000 a year. Where are those people living? $150,000 plus. Salary. Where are those people living? We could probably go in and produce a map of the highest concentration of cars or motorcycles. So we have a lot of socio-demographic data, and the model takes that into consideration. So it doesn't necessarily assume that because one TAS has a high concentration of high-income people, now that'll be the case in the future. It's tied to the real estate market and the housing prices.
Which makes sense, because if we go through a recession, you'll see less jobs, you'll see less, so it'll be reflected in the model as you update the model.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Into our Pikes Peak region, I don't know if that's part of the data that you have.
Yeah, so I think that goes back to the control total about the population growth. So basically the main thing behind this, it's called a location choice model, and so that's how it's tied to real estate and the real estate market of what's an attractive area for someone to open their business or to buy a house. And there's a little bit of an element of randomness. So say, for example, you wanted to buy a house and you had $300,000 to spend on the house. There's probably, 50 houses in this region for sale right now in your price range. And so maybe they're all equally attractive to you according to the model. So basically it takes into account a number of different factors to decide where you, as a household, based on your income and your characteristics, are going to choose to locate.
So we keep ending up on those top 10 places to live. Are you seeing that effect at all?
Well, so again, that goes back to the control total. So if the state demographer saw, the article in Washington Post or whatever and said, we've been seeing 6% growth rate, we're going to start seeing 8%, then she would have factored that in.
Okay.
But that's kind of independent of what we're doing because we're not in the business of forecasting that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Obviously, that there are many uses for the output from the scenario planning. One of the key ones will be where major roads should be built, where freeways should be built as opposed to two-laners, things of that nature. When will those types of information become available that will be of kind of interest to us specifically?
Yeah, so that's kind of the piece that we're working on now with the travel model integration. So we go back and forth in 5-year increments, and the land use model and the travel model kind of talk to each other. And so I give Ken output from Urban Sim that says where development is expected to occur in the coming years, and he puts that into the travel model. So basically what happens on his side is that tells you something about how long it's going to take you to get between different zones. And so you have a travel time piece that then gets factored in. That's a piece that determines how attractive an area is for development or to move or to locate a business. So that goes back and forth. The piece about the actual projects, so that's related to our project scoring, which we just approved, the scoring criteria and the weighting. And so these 3 scenarios in some form will influence the project scoring. So either you're inside or you're outside of so it's not going to be the infill mask itself. It's going to be some measure of density, but basically you're going to have 3 different scenarios, and a project will score differently under all 3 scenarios. So when people are trying to get a project into the 2045 long-range plan, that's where this will come into play.
Okay, because I guess stating an opinion here, it takes forever to get major projects not only into the plan, but then to get them funded and get them started. I-25 Gap, Route 24 at I-25, I mean, those are long history projects. Based upon the projections here, it would appear that there's going to be the need sooner rather than later to start figuring out some major roads that would intersect with those big growth areas.
Yeah, so one major use for this information is, so obviously our member governments are the ones who are actually doing things on the ground, right? So we're providing this information as this is a growth trend or a growth trajectory, and then hopefully they look at that when they're submitting projects for consideration, and that's really the purpose of having the 3 different land use scenarios, that these are 3 different reasonable possible futures, and if you want to prepare for them, try to choose projects that will score well under all 3 is really the idea. So it's a tool, a piece of information for people submitting projects for consideration.
Does anybody else have any questions? Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. We'll be back next month looking for a recommendation.
Excellent.
Okay.
Brian? Is it a rule that Mountain Metro Transit people must have a first name of Brian?
It might be. I kind of wish I had all the pretty pictures that Jennifer had. Going to have to get a hold of some of those. Let's see. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this item to you. My name is Brian Champion. I work at Mountain Metro, and I'm here to introduce to you One Ride, a new call center that we're planning. So in July, Mountain Metro Transit will begin operating a call center that functions as a management hub, a hub where incoming requests for transportation, either over the phone or online, will be managed, where trip requests will be assigned to transportation providers, where the dissemination of transportation-related information and referrals will occur, and where the community's transportation needs will be collected and quantified. I'll walk you through how and why One Ride came about and describe the benefit it brings to the community, both in the short and midterm. So just a reminder of what Mountain Metro provides the community. Our fixed route service operates along 27 routes, providing about 3 million annual trips, with an estimated 300,000 trips taken by seniors and 200,000 by people with disabilities. Metro Mobility is an ADA paratransit service for people unable to use fixed route. It is a demand response service, requiring passengers to call in advance to reserve a trip. Metro Mobility operates a call center to take reservations, schedule trips, and dispatch buses. On average, they provide about 165,000 trips annually. 11,000 of those trips are provided with taxis. Specialized transportation is a service for seniors and people with disabilities, a larger service area, and a level of care beyond that required by the ADA, as well as including senior citizens, not a group covered by the ADA, defines the above and beyond character of this service. Specialized transportation is also a demand response service requiring advanced reservations. Over 39,000 trips were provided in 2017 using $800,000 in city and RTA funds. The service delivery model for specialized transportation has been in place for many years, and it looks like this. The city contracts with 4 human service providers, abbreviated HSPs. To reserve a trip, passengers call HSPs directly, requiring each of them to operate a call center. If a trip is available, the HSP will reserve it. An HSP can offer an alternative when a preferred time is unavailable. When an alternative is not available, a passenger must call one or more HSPs to reserve a trip. Shopping a trip is another scenario which occurs and is where a passenger reserves trips with multiple HSPs to ensure the best fit to their desired trip time. This approach requires a passenger to call each HSP back to cancel a trip that they overbooked. But either scenario takes time and resources to manage. Over the years, PPACG members and stakeholders have looked at this service delivery model and seen areas where the community could benefit from some modifications to the model, recommending the consolidation of call center activities to lower administrative costs by minimizing duplicated services, to make it more convenient for the public to access transportation options by creating a one point of contact service, to expand transportation services and expand the number of organizations providing services. So these are the themes reflected in recommendations and preferred alternatives in these planning documents. The response to these recommendations is a nexus for One Ride. This graphic shows One Ride's dual functions and subsidiary activities, And I'll review these activities in the coming slides. Here is the specialized transportation branch of One Ride, and I'll expand on each activity and its benefits. In the short term, a centralized call center means the community only needs to call one number or execute one mouse click to access city and RTA-funded trips, whereas now multiple calls may be necessary. With One Ride, we'll be able to see all the availability with each provider to ensure the best scheduled fit. This best fit scheduling could mean a trip on one or more HSPs to ensure the shortest distance traveled and time closest to the desired schedule. One caller, one click, and One Ride will do the work for each passenger. Another benefit is increased access to reservationists. One Ride will be open Monday through Sunday, 8 to 5. So a caller will have a live answer access to a reservationist every day. We've offered to live answer all weekend calls to HSPs as a service enhancement. Since we'll be reserving all city and RTA-funded trips, we'll be able to identify opportunities to group rides together. This is to minimize the occurrence of more than one bus serving the same area at the same time. Since HSP service areas overlap and they serve many of the same major trip generators, there should be opportunities to group trips. Again, sending one bus instead of two. And again, with the aim of minimizing duplicated service. As a side note, Mountain Metro asked a consultant to look into grouping trips. The consultant was surprised to find no buses traveling in the same direction at the same time. And that conclusion surprises me too. I think this conclusion may have been more to do with a limited sample size and incomplete methodology than the conclusion that no buses were found traveling in the same direction at the same time. But with all the data we'll be collecting, we will be able to identify and take advantage of any opportunity there is to group trips. We'll also be looking to lower costs by brokering trips. Brokering is simply assigning trips based on trip cost. As mentioned, cost has not been considered in selecting a trip. And since there is no standardized pricing among HSP, the cost of a trip has been decided when a passenger calls an HSP to reserve a trip. And I'll circle back to this in the next slide. Excuse me. By centralizing calls, One Ride will be in a more informed position to assess the extent to which these services are meeting the community's needs and to make recommended adjustments. Midterm benefits will include expanded service to after hours and weekends and expanding the service area to reach outlying areas. And we'll do this by expanding the number of providers. There will always be a place for HSPs as they provide the highest level of care. But not all passengers need this level of care, so diversification will help us to meet these goals. Since One Ride will be reserving trips on behalf of HSPs, this should minimize staffing needs among HSPs and translate into lower administrative costs. And I'd like to make the point to say that One Ride will be reserving and assigning city and RTA funded trips. HSPs use other funds to provide trips, Area Agency on Aging being one of the largest funding sources. HSPs have chosen to continue making reservations for these funded trips, but we're hoping that with our demonstrated success that will convince them that all call center activities should be consolidated with One Ride. Moreover, we'll be practicing what we preach. Internally, we'll be consolidating the Metro Mobility Call Center with One Ride with the aim to minimize duplicate activities, allowing us to shift resources from administration to operations. Each of these consolidated efforts will translate into more trips for the senior and disabled community. So brokering trips is another way One Ride will do more with the same funding. We asked HSPs to provide the fully burdened cost of providing a trip by mileage band, and you'll see that on the left of the graph. Shown here is the cost of a 0 to 5 mile trip. As you can see, Agency A will provide the trip at a cost of just over $13. Since this is the lowest cost solution, we'll offer this trip to Agency A and as many other 5-mile trips as they can handle. Once Agency A has reached capacity, we'll reserve trips with Agency C, the next lowest cost solution. But notice, 2 trips can be made on Agency A for every trip on Agency C. When Agency C's capacity is exceeded, we'll move on to Agency B. Yes.
Do you use brokers? Thank you. Do you use brokers such as Uber and Lyft?
That is a possibility that we're looking into the future.
Okay.
Right now, for this first year, we'll be using the existing 4 providers, but that would be a tool that we would like to add to our toolbox.
Yeah, because I saw that you were using taxis.
Yes, we do for paratransit trips, and it's been very successful, and it's at a much lower rate.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
You use the term fully burdened.
Yes.
What would you define that for me?
Good question. That means what the trip actually costs when you add in fuel and maintenance and driver costs and administrative fee. In the past, a human service provider may split fund a trip, meaning they might have one grant that they match with another grant, and they charge us X amount of dollars, but that's not what it really costs to provide that trip. What we want to do is take the bigger picture and best utilize all transportation dollars in the community, not just what they're charging us. So that's what we mean by the fully burdened cost. It's really what it costs that agency to provide that trip by the mileage band. So 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20.
So it's not consumer-driven? It's not the cost to the consumer?
Exactly. It's the cost to provide the trip by the provider.
So whose data do you use to
we have a
burden the
competitive bid price process, and the providers bid for a share of grant funds to provide the trips. And in that, they provide us, this is a cost per trip, which is reflected here. So Agency A bid $13.11.
Are these actual numbers, or are these kind of made-up numbers?
No, these are actual numbers. So starting July 1st, a 5-mile trip will cost we'll pay Agency A $13.11 to provide that trip, as opposed to Agency C, the next lowest, which is twice as much, $26. And then, of course, the $31.75 for Agency B.
Who are the agencies?
The agencies are community intersections. Actually, I'll back up and show you. On the right, community intersections in Vida, Fountain Valley Senior Center, and Silver Key Senior Services. So those are the 4 current providers.
Yeah, they're the ones with the vans you see that have the branding of Metro Mobility on the outside?
No, those are paratransit vehicles that we operate.
That you operate, okay.
So you'll see Silver Key, you'll see Amblicab, that's the former name of Invita. You'll see community intersection vans. They'll all be marked for the agency that they provide service.
Okay.
I need to follow up with just a little bit.
Yes, sir.
That schedule that you did, is there a charge to the consumer? So if I call and I want to go 0 to 5 miles, and Agency C's charging me $1, and Agency A's charging me $20, why would I don't care what your cost is, I only care what my cost is.
That's right.
So how do you factor that in?
That's a great point. So before one ride, a person just like you wanting a trip, they don't see this information. The trip is free to them. There's no fare required. So if they liked Agency A, the bus driver for Agency A, they would call them for the trip.
Okay, so the consumer pays zero in all of these situations?
Yes, and they have no idea
That
what the
answers
trip
my
costs. So, excellent question. So thank you for asking.
Brian,
Yes.
are the four agencies basically providing the same kind of transportation over the same geography? So that you've got, when you're, for example, Agency A, I'm wondering if it's more localized, therefore they're not trying to operate over the same geographic area, and they might be charging less because they don't have to maintain their vehicles as often. And Agency C is operating vehicles that are covering, say, the whole county.
The service areas largely overlap. There's not a lot of one agency exclusively servicing an area. They all really service the same area.
And they are providing the same kinds of
The
service?
same level of care, relatively using the same vehicles.
So Amblicab and Fountain Valley Senior Center are providing service to the same kind of clients?
Exactly. Yeah. Community Intersections has a relatively exclusive clientele of intellectually and developmentally disabled individuals that may not be provided a ride on the other services, just because of the level of care those clients need. The other three carry mostly the same type of client.
So Amblicab and Silver Key, for example, are providing service to the same people?
With a caveat, this year Silver Key will not be providing transportation for people with disabilities. They're going to exclusively service senior citizens. Yeah. But again, the service areas overlap, largely the same clientele, largely the same standard of care, which is door through door, a very high level of care, assisting passengers from inside their residence to inside the vehicle. Once they arrive at their destination, they will escort the individual, God bless you, and any groceries, if they went on a grocery trip, back into their residence. So a very high level of care.
I'm sorry, I'm easily confused here. Community Intersections?
Yes.
They have a fairly well-defined subset of people, right?
Correct.
And I think you just said that Silver Key will not be serving, ADA-type
People with
ride
disabilities.
needs?
Right. So they're going to limit
So
their...
how do you plan to apportion out? Do you necessarily know when somebody calls in, or is that the plan, when somebody calls in, that you will query them on what kind of support they need?
Yeah, we have a fairly large client database that has that information already. But if we get a new caller, we will ask them, what is your level of care? Are you ambulatory? Do you have a mobility device? So, we'll go through a script of questions to outline what their need is.
Okay.
And then we'll fit that to the appropriate carrier.
Okay.
Again, adding this dimension of what does the trip cost. So, again, before, a client might be familiar with one agency or another, and they just habitually use that carrier, but there's no consideration of cost. Here, we know what the cost is, and we want to assign that trip. So,
I think Kevin's point, though, was you're working with one set of cost figures, and the passenger is working with a different set of cost.
There's no
No.
cost to the passenger.
so to the passenger, there is no cost.
So they don't,
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
so they don't care.
No, that's the
So-
problem. So that,
If I call and I just need a ride to, Ecumenical Social Ministries or something for a reason,
Okay?
Amblicab might be assigned my ride.
If, as the way it has been and up to June 30th of this year, you would have made that decision to who you called.
Right.
If it was Amblicab, yeah, they would take you. They would give you that transportation at no cost to you. However, we're paying for that trip. MMT is, or the whole area is paying for that trip.
We're paying for that.
And it's not a standardized price. It's what that agency says it costs them to make that trip, the fully burdened cost. So what we want to move into is a consolidated call center, and we'll be making that assignment. So you'll call me. I'll look at the cost per trip and the availability at each agency, and I'll assign it. I'll say, Jim, I'm going to put you on Silver Key, and that's on your outbound trip. And to give you the best fit schedule, I'm going to put you on Invita going home. Now, there'll be a placard on the vehicle that says one ride. It'll come to the residence or the address that you gave us, take you there and bring you back home. But we'll be assigning that, not the passenger just calling an agency, because we want to control costs. And as you can see, we can provide 2 trips with Agency A as opposed to Agency C. So here is the pricing for a 5 to 10 mile trip. Because they, again, are the lowest cost solution, we'll book as many trips with Agency A as possible. And there are some other considerations besides cost. There's the clientele, there's the location of buses during that time, that day, and there's schedule considerations that may limit our flexibility. But cost will be our starting place. So prior to one ride, trip cost was not a consideration. Again, to us, not the client. By choosing the HSP, passengers were, in essence, choosing the cost per trip, unbeknownst to them. One ride will be assigning trips with cost as the first consideration. So here is the remaining trip costs. And you'll see the emphasis has now shifted from Agency A to Agency B. They're now the lowest cost provider. So we'll be assigning as many trips to Agency B for 10, 15, and 20 mile trips. Now this slide shows the regional transportation branch of One Ride. For residents, those new to the community and visitors, or for family members wanting to know how to transport aging and or disabled parents or children, knowing how to get around town and who to call to find out can be challenging. To address this challenge, we are assembling an inventory of all or nearly all transportation providers in the Pikes Peak region. One Ride will be a clearinghouse of transportation options. So public transit, private vans and shuttles, taxis, TNC companies, trip sharing information, medical-related carriers will all be included in the inventory. For all types of transportation providers, we will have information about their service to make a referral. And these referrals will be need-based referrals, reflecting the needs of the person inquiring about the options. We'll have fare and reservation requirements, clientele served, accessible vehicle information, and the like. We'll also be stitching together individualized trip plans and coordinating trips among providers. This is a role that One Ride is well suited to perform. Also, growing a transportation database is another important function we'll bring to the community. Being on the receiving end of questions about transportation will enable us to collect and quantify the community's needs. So a lot less estimating demand or gaps in service. We'll be able to quantify needs and adjust services accordingly. Most importantly, we'll be able to provide that information to stakeholders to consider as they make regional transportation choices. Listed here are some of the programs we are interested in pursuing: a veterans-focused van pool, volunteer driver and mileage reimbursement programs, and a call-a-ride service to enable us to bring passengers from outlying areas into the Metro Mobility Service Area. So what we're trying to implement is not a one-size-fits-all type of transportation solution. We believe that it's going to take a lot of little things, a lot of tools in the toolbox to address all the community's needs or best fit what their needs are.
Okay, I have a question on the van.
The veterans, is that for local, or is that to go to Denver?
That's both.
Both.
And it's not just to the VA in town in Denver, it's whatever a veteran might need.
Okay.
But we really want to focus on a veteran providing the driving. We have a lot of retired vets here
Who could do,
that will volunteer to drive the van, and we are out looking for vans now,
okay,
but dedicated to providing veteran service.
okay.
Yes, sir.
Kevin?
When these were put out for bid, for the different agencies and how much the trip cost would be, was there any cutoff that said, you're way too expensive, we're going to throw that one out?
There was not. No.
So whatever they said, they got to be in the pool no matter what the cost was?
Yes. So they got in the door, but it'll be up to us to assign the trips. So it's not just carte blanche, we're going to give each agency a certain amount of trips. We're going to assign those trips based on the need of the community. So basically, we have a lot of 0 to 10 mile trip requests. And so we're letting competition and the price that they provide us dictate who we're going to assign those trips to. But not one agency has enough capacity, either vehicles or drivers, to provide all the services that the community requests.
If one of the people that call up, the writer says, I don't like that company, the guy doesn't drive good, the gal doesn't drive good, I want a different company, what happens?
Well, first that would initiate an investigation of why that passenger is complaining about the service. That happens with our paratransit service. If a client doesn't like a driver, we don't necessarily immediately assign it to another driver. We investigate what the issue is with that particular operator, and we would handle it the same way.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of questions. What, I wouldn't want to be Agency C, or the one that was on the right there, because I don't think I'm going to get very many calls, one. That's going to start to drive up costs, and you're going to start to put that agency under pressure to deal with those costs, with that now cost issue, right?
Yes.
So that's one. Is this done anywhere else?
Yes.
What unintended consequences are going to occur out of this, or have occurred out of this?
There are going to be challenges. For instance, it is a new model for, as you're saying, the existing HSP providers. It is a new model. Although it's been in the planning for many years, it is an evolving landscape, and we all have to evolve, as Mountain Metro has done by adding taxis. It's just it's another way to provide more trips at the same cost. That is our focus. It's going to be a challenge for our customers. You may be a 10 or 15-year customer of Silver Key. You might not want to use another provider.
Exactly. I think this question was over here.
It is.
Where is the consumer preference in this model? And I guess, the centralizing thing is going to have the unintended consequence of driving some of these agencies that provide a different level of customer service out of business based on a cost model.
It may tend to limit the amount of trips that are given to Agency C, yes. On the flip side, if we're looking at the community and wanting to provide them with the most amount of trips for the same amount of money, assigning based on cost is the right way to do it.
That's my point exactly. The consumer preference in there for service is not in the model. This is strictly a cost model.
If there is a consumer or a client or a passenger that is adamant that they don't want to ride Agency A as opposed to Agency C, we'll accommodate that. We're not going to exclude someone or keep someone from a dialysis appointment or medical appointment or anything because they don't want to use Agency A. what we will do is take that opportunity to counsel that passenger and let them know why we are suggesting what we are.
Yeah, well, I, for one, prefer the consumer model and the competition model. But,
Well,
I mean, that's.
I got you,
so.
and I can appreciate that.
Okay.
But when we're looking at the cost of 13 versus 35, I can
No,
provide...
I understand that, too, so that's fine.
And
It's the problem
I
with
think this
selling
model
something
does
for nothing.
provide competition by the very nature of the fact that we're going to, through the one ride, or the one call center, drive people towards, as much as possible, the lower cost ones. And that doesn't necessarily mean the higher cost ones aren't going to get anything. I mean, there's only so many rides each agency can provide, and there's some schedules that aren't just going to work. But there's also, the consumer needs to adapt and understand there's limited funds out there. And a lot of times the consumer just has a preference because that's what they like. I'm sorry, but that doesn't mean that you get to pick the most expensive option.
Exactly.
Either, so.
Yeah. There's also the, if it is
Exactly.
consumer-driven and they always
You
choose
wanna
one
pay for it,
agency
go
over
for
the
it.
other, they're missing the opportunity to have a better fit schedule. I'm not just going to look at one agency. I'm going to look at 4 and say, you know, the one that you've always preferred could provide a 2 o'clock trip, but you're really asking for a 1 o'clock trip. I have 3 other agencies that I could fit you in there. So I think if we focus on the very short term, the first few months, yeah, it's going to be a little painful and there's going to be challenges. But if we look out over 3, 4, 5, 6 years, we'll be able to provide so much more service with the available resources that we have.
Go ahead, Hal.
What is the plan to promote, communicate, educate, all the things that go around making this an easier change, particularly for those people that are very used to their way of doing things?
Well, one thing, we're having a very soft opening. So we envision the first 1 or 2 months is we'll be receiving the calls, we'll be educating our passengers that we can provide trips with other providers, but to ease everyone into this new evolving landscape, we will continue to book you or book your trips onto the carrier that you used to. But we will make suggestions that, you know, if you would like, we'll book you on another one at the more conducive time. And it also is at a lower cost, or maybe at a lower cost.
Is there a change in phone numbers that people call, or does everything stay the same, but it's routed to your center?
Both. So you can call the existing HSP and they'll soft transfer the call to us. At that time, we'll give them our direct number so they can start calling us directly.
Okay.
Yes.
Courtney, and then Aubrey.
I think I'm kind of echoing a couple of questions that have popped up, but I do want to express I'm pretty unsatisfied with the answer about how you're putting the word out about this whole process, because I think doing it as it started and as you go along is going to be, well, and I guess I look at it in comparison to how you do public input meetings for service changes or any sort of informational meeting that people can come, or a training video or a flyer or something that can be out in the world versus people having to go through that training process on the phone with you when they already have a need to schedule a ride or they're trying to get something done. So I guess I would like to express it'd be great if there was more of a proactive process in what's going on leading up to July, because I don't know that people know
I'm
what's
sorry,
going
I gave
on.
a limited answer. So there'll be a direct mailer to all existing users of each of the HSPs, as well as a marketing campaign. We have radio and television ads. So there will be kind of a full court press on the advertising, yes.
But not necessarily a space for people to come ask questions. It's more, here's the information.
You mean like a focus group or going out into the community to hold group meetings?
Yeah, some sort of public
Yes.
process.
Yes, I think that's a good suggestion.
I think that would be good. I totally understand the thought around efficiency, and I also recognize that for people's general expectations and schedules, at least being able to have a conversation about it versus having those habits changed via a flyer will probably make the process easier for you guys as well.
Yes, right. And we do want to take every opportunity we can to speak individually with with each one of our passengers.
Aubrey?
Thank you.
I imagine there's some concern about potentially quality decreasing as a result of having to be competitive. If they've got to go eventually come down in price to be able to keep up, that kind of thing. So I guess my question is, you're going to get a fair amount of qualitative input about what people think about the change, I'm sure. Will you have a sense of beforehand if, across the board, typically a person has to wait 3 hours to get assigned a ride, and after one ride it will take them this long, and that kind of thing?
Well, we don't have a lot of view into how the service is provided now, because the calls are directed to the HSP and they provide the service. What we are instituting, though, is since we will be getting the calls, there's a lot of dynamics that we'll be looking at. Hold time, wait time, call time, drop calls in the queue. That's on the reserving a trip. We also have put into the contract with each HSP that if there's a customer complaint, they will be directed to our communications department. So we'll be tracking any kind of quality issues there. Again, we don't have a lot of vision into how it's being done now because we don't manage the service.
Jim?
Brian, a couple of clarifications, if I might. Did I understand at the beginning you said that you are already funding, you are providing some funding to each of these HSPs for them to provide transportation, regardless of what it costs them to do that? You have some amount of money that you're giving each year?
Correct.
Okay. What will be the effect of that process with this new scheduling and transportation assignment process?
Well, there will be a certain minimum level of rides that we give each of the HSPs for one of those concerns that you have. Our intention is not to drive anyone out of business. But then what we will do is begin brokering trips, and we'll be looking at the lowest cost solutions.
Okay. And my second question is, did this idea, which has been, quote, bubbling around for a number of years, did this originate from the HSPs, or did this originate in Metro Transit? Or somewhere else?
It's
like
been
in Aubrey's office somewhere.
It's been reflected in a lot of PPACG's long-range plans. I think the last 3 long-range plans have alternatives or recommendations that say, do a call center. There was one effort, and I think it was, the acronym was ACT, Accessible Community Transportation, where it was actually the 4 HSPs getting together and trying to establish a nonprofit agency to provide a call center, but I don't think that went through to fruition.
Okay.
Three hopefully brief questions. Brian, thank you for this presentation. It's raised a lot of questions as well as being very informative. My first question is, have we given you a chance to complete the presentation to forestall any more questions?
Actually, the questions are wonderful, and
Okay.
all I had was this last slide of progress.
Okay. Can I let you finish that before I ask anything else?
All I wanted to say again is there's a lot of opportunities, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of challenges. Again, for us, there's a challenge on administering this. There's a challenge with the HSPs to adapt to this new, this new mechanism. And then for the clients, it's going to be difficult. There's no getting around it. If I look in the first few months of this, I would say it's a pretty daunting activity. But if I focus on 1 and 2 years out, it's the right thing for the community. That's my belief. So I'm finished.
Well, I have two more questions. I'll try to be brief. First, to Kevin's original, one of your original questions. What I have seen over time with the VIA system in northern Denver, the Boulder metro area, is that VIA began as a one-up opportunity for people with mobility issues of any kind to get personal curb-to-curb service. And they encountered all kinds of issues with that scheduling, but they have eventually evolved into a bridge between RTD and the Boulder Metropolitan Bus Service, which is a hub service. And they have trained their dispatchers to defer calls that are complicated to a set of counselors who now counsel clients and assist them. Some of them end up with a third form of transportation, which includes the AMR, literally a reserved ambulance, if their needs are that great for coordinated care for the entire trip. So it's turned out to be a far more sophisticated system than originally envisioned. And it's not without its issues. It's certainly not without its quirks. But people over time are getting better care. And again, they're searching for the right combination of grants, funding, for the kind of care needed, and they're taking the demographics as they're learning and applying them to the way they reach out for more grants and do more planning.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping, that leads to my last question, I'm wondering if you can tell us, is it the goal here with One Ride to ultimately take the data coming in from your call center about the requested rides and then the data that you're acquiring internally from the actual rides completed? And are you planning to build the program based on what the riders are requesting and actually needing?
Yeah, that's what I try to convey by saying now that we'll be the purveyors of that information, we won't have to do sampling or estimating or guesstimating what the demand or the gap in service is. We'll know what it is by the questions that we receive.
Well, thank you, because I personally, for Teller County, for City of Woodland Park, and for Green Mountain Falls, Chipeta Park, and for Cascade, would love to find that you're going to see that there is a need to reestablish some sort of shuttle or van ride or cooperative commuting as we had as recently as 2013 in the past, all the way out to Divide beyond Woodland Park. The need still exists, and our population continues to evolve and change in a direction where cooperative transportation is still highly desirable, if not required, for
Yes.
people to retire and live in place.
Yes. If
Thank
I could just add on to that, your question about Lyft and Uber, again, we don't see one solution being the right solution for everything. Sending out a 20-passenger van to service that area might not be the most efficient. If the need isn't a wheelchair-accessible bus, we might send out, in the future, an Uber or Lyft to make that trip. So the transportation will be there at a relatively competitive price. And when I say competitive, I don't mean we're going to be ruthless or heartless and just look at the bottom line. That's not what we're about. What we are trying to do is provide more with what we have, because the demand keeps going, keeps increasing, but not in lockstep with the revenues we have. So there's something else that we have to do, and it might be just the model that we implement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Is there-
No? Oh, sorry. We have another one?
And I think John
Oh,
did as well.
sorry. John.
This is going to be a works in progress for a while.
Yes, it is.
What happens if one of the ones that bid bow out because they can't afford the price they offered? What takes place? In other words, the low one says, this doesn't work, we're losing money. Are there performance bonds that require them to complete their contract?
There are no performance bonds to force them to continue at a price that they can't sustain. So we've tried to go the extra mile and ask twice with clarification if this is a fully burdened cost. Our emphasis to our HSPs is, I don't want you to provide a trip that I'm not paying your entire cost for, because that's not our intention, is to purposely drive someone out of business.
It's going to be interesting if you come back in a year and tell us how this thing went.
Well, actually, that is a
Because the
great
change will take
suggestion.
place. It will take place.
I would like to do that.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, great idea. I was actually wondering, can we request that some sort of like satisfaction survey be done after 6 months into this process, just so we have some sort of baseline or process of feedback as you're ongoing?
Yes.
And you had mentioned if there is a strong preference that people use a particular provider, that you would counsel them, but you would accommodate that. Is that written into policy?
Well, we're writing policies now. Every week, we've been meeting with our HSPs and going through policies and procedures.
So the piece about how you're going to accommodate that strong preference might be wise to call out.
Yes.
And then lastly, you said that providers that are using AAA-funded rides are scheduling their own, correct? How does that distinction work?
AAA funding does not go through
One ride.
one ride. It goes directly to the HSPs.
Right. So will people directly call the HSPs if they're trying to get, and will they know whether it's AAA-funded rides or how?
To the customer, they don't know how a trip is funded, and they shouldn't have to.
Right.
When we receive that call, if it meets the criteria for AAA, we will send that back through software to the HSP to provide that trip.
Okay.
What we would like to do, and what I hope I conveyed, is with our demonstrated success, we're hoping that those trips will, not the funding, we don't want to be the funder.
Right.
We just want to be able to book those trips. And again, that lowers administrative costs, because when you look at the cost per trip, some of that is for a reservationist or a scheduler or a dispatcher. We want to do that internally by combining our call centers, Metro Mobility, and One Ride.
I just wonder if it will create confusion if people are sometimes able to call specifically the HSP and get a ride because it's AAA funded, but other times...
It may. It may, and that's a process we really need to work out. And I think we can.
I believe it as well.
Again, I don't want to sugarcoat the challenge, but I think there's a lot of benefit from implementing a centralized call center.
Likewise, full support.
Brian, Michelle's trying to cut me off, but I
told him he hit his limit.
Yeah, I haven't heard a word yet about how much this is costing to set up and your operating budget, in addition to what you're already funding for rides and things.
That's a good question, because there are going to be some increases in short-term costs. As One Ride staffs up, it's going to cost about $250,000 for our reservationists. We're not going to see an offsetting reduction in staffing at the HSPs immediately. But there has to be some kickoff point, and we have to implement this first to see those short, mid-range, and long-term reductions in staff. So at first, yeah, it's going to cost us some money just to get started.
And you're setting up like in a room like this, so what does that configuration cost?
So that has been provided by it's 5310 funding. We used another grant to build out an existing facility that we have. We'll be on the second floor. There's computers, there's a phone system. We're using existing scheduling software. So that's part of the progress that we've already made.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brian, really appreciate the
Thank you very much.
presentation.
I really appreciate the questions, really. Thank you.
Good presentation.
All right, who's going to do the legislative update? Aha.
Thank you very much.
So I am Jenny Lyons. I'm actually standing in for Jessica McMullen, who is at our strategic plan meeting up in Woodland Park. So just as in the memo, you actually had the bills that we actually monitored. We didn't take any stances on any bills this legislative session. One of the big ones, obviously, was Senate Bill 001, which did repass. And she requested that if you have any questions, I'll write them down, and she will definitely email back everyone with her answers if you have any specific questions on any of these bills. So, anyone? Perfect.
Fabulous. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
All right, Ken.
Good afternoon, Ken Prather, PPACG Transportation Planner. Last month, I introduced you to CDOT's Transit Development Plan. This is an inventory of statewide transit needs that they are developing. And then from all of those needs, they want a recommendation from
entities throughout the state as to what are the priority needs. And I wanted to bring you some additional information prior to next month, where it'll be time to make a recommendation to the board. CDOT has clarified that they are looking for all transit needs, both capital and operational. And this will be an ongoing effort. They will be updating the list continuously as new needs are identified. And as others or projects are completed, then they'll be taken off the list. And so it'll be a constant revision. As far as the recommended priority projects, remember, I think I had introduced a concept, and remember, this is a planning document. It is not a funding document, a financial document. We're talking treasure chest and pots of money at the end of the rainbow. So for the priority list, CDOT was proposing a $2 billion list, limiting the priority projects to $2 billion. They have since revised that to $1.5 billion. And for our region, they're saying, for planning purposes, we would get 9%, or $135 million. They're very weak on their methodology as to how they came up with that 9%. And there has been, yes, and there has been some discussion as to why is that so low. But that is currently what they are asking for. John Leosados, the new transportation director, has said we are going to develop a prioritized list of 15%. So instead of a $135 million list, it'll be a $225 million list. And that'll be our priorities, and we will give that to them, and they will do what they want with it. The prioritized list must be capital projects only, so we're going to identify total capital and operational needs, but we're only going to develop the priority list from capital bondable projects. This is creating the list in anticipation of legislative action from the legislature that just ended this month, and whatever passes on the ballot initiative this fall in November. The funding for that is bonding, so it's a 20-year bond. It doesn't make sense to fix a bench at a bus stop or buy a bus that only lives for 12 years, and then you're paying the interest on it for 20. So the only new projects that have been identified since last month, remember I introduced, Michael Snow had gone through our 2040 long-range plan and identified all the projects that were funded in it, and that's where he came up with that first list of projects that you saw last month, and is in your packet again as attachment 2. The new projects that have been identified also come from the 2040 plan, but these were projects that were not funded. They were requested funds, they were evaluated, they were scored, but they didn't rank high enough, and so they didn't get funded. So we've added that list of projects to the inventory. Both the TAC and the Mobility Coordinating Committee have reviewed this materials. They did not come up with any additional projects for consideration. And as far as how to prioritize the project, the TAC recommended using the scores that were developed when projects were evaluated for the 2040 plan. And some of those projects scored high enough, and they got into the plan. Other projects didn't score. But as I identified in the memo, we've got close to $1 billion worth of projects. About a little over $600 million of those are capital bondable projects. And even if we go 225 million, that's a third of the projects that we've identified. So we're going to have to prioritize them somehow. Tax recommendation was to use the projects that were already selected in our plan, the handout in attachment 2, and then if there's enough money that we go to the unfunded list, then we would use the scores that these projects received in the 2040 scoring process. So that was the proposal. So what I'm looking for today is answer any questions. If you have any more projects that should be added to the list, and if you have a different method of prioritizing the high priority projects, then we would like to hear those.
Ken, none of this has anything to do with the GAP project, correct?
Pardon?
None of this has anything to do with the I-25 GAP project. These are all just
These are all
2040.
transit. All transit.
Okay.
Okay, so these aren't the overall projects. These are all transit projects.
All transit projects only. CDOT will be coming forward sometime in the future for bike ped projects. So that'll be their third phase of their total plan.
Anybody have any discussion questions for Ken?
Just one.
Again, I'm cutting you off too. Wrong button.
I am not good with this thing. I had it. That's good. I just wanted to, is there additional, because I'm not always familiar with which routes are which, by the transit route 1 and stage 2 enhancements, and these are documented where? Just so if I have questions, I can take a look at it.
These are on the Colorado Springs Mountain Metropolitan
On their website?
website.
Okay.
They identify and they have maps that'll show you
The routes.
where each route goes.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Hal?
Is there a point in the future that the Community Advisory Committee gets to give its opinion on the funding percentage that CDOT is proposing?
Give that to me today if you have one. I know Andy Gunning, the new executive director, and transportation director, John Leosados, they are dissatisfied with that.
Because, one of the things, I've been a part of CAC for several years now, and we were very hesitant to use our power. We really are. There are times where I think we, as a Community Advisory Committee, should stand up and really make a statement. And we've done that maybe twice, Jim? 2 or 3 times, where we've taken something to the board saying, we disagree.
Yes.
And each time, there was a positive outcome to that. In other words, there was modification to a decision.
And I completely agree, Helen. I think we certainly should do that. In this case, it's not the board that can make any kind of decision to change that. It's something that has to obviously go to CDOT, but I think we should.
One of those cases, there was a change made by CDOT because they made a prioritization that was totally the opposite in one of the key project areas to what we and other, I think TAC as well, had proposed. And in that case, we made a formal resolution that we disagreed, that we wanted CDOT to listen to our planning organizations, our experts. And I do think there's an opportunity. I don't know if it's today, but there's an opportunity, I think, for us to expect that El Paso County and the PPACG geographical area gets its proper due.
I concur. I'm happy to entertain if somebody wants to, put a motion together for a resolution that we send forward to the board. Yes, Ms. Allen.
I think we could even go, I agree with you, Hal, and I think we could even go as far as saying that it is clear to the community at large, and we as its representatives, that the funding approach that CDOT is taking region by region is inappropriate. And I'll go as far as personally saying, it's my opinion, it's unfair. And it's a long history of this. And it's high time for the best interest of the entire state that they take a more informed tact.
I don't know about inappropriate, but it's incongruent with the growth and...
Absolutely.
And the population in the area,
Yeah.
so...
Better tempered set of terms, and I thank you for
Yes.
I think it'd be great if someone would make a motion. I'm not prepared
Go
to
for
do
it,
that.
Hal.
Well, you know, verbalizing it.
Before you do,
I just have one question, and not one question, one comment, is that before we make a resolution, we need to make a resolution that has some sound backing, not just that we're ticked off because this is not enough. If we have some documented evidence of the comparison in population, the comparison in economic impact, something that lends some credibility. I mean, they make decisions, and we're going, how'd you make this decision? What was it based on? But what we need to do is be able to, from an educated fashion, come back and say, well, based on A, B, C, D, we should be getting, X amount of money, or X percentage of that budget. So I worry about sending something that is just sheer opinion without any type of...
As I said, it may be early. I'm sorry. Just, I think.
No, but it's a good
I
discussion
think the
point.
timing may be 1 month too early. Next month might be an ideal time that it's part of the project selection process. And oh, by the way, this is the opinion of the PPACG CAC.
But we would need, documentation that we are the most populated county in the state. I mean, something like that, in order to bring this forward.
I think we have that information, or at least...
I'd also recommend that whatever we do with the resolution, it's got to say 9% isn't enough, but here's what it should
Right.
be based on.
Mhm.
So
Right.
don't just say 9%, don't leave it open-ended. Say it should be more like 30%.
Right.
Okay, I'll buy that.
Okay.
So,
Ken?
I wasn't at the meeting where CDOT presented this to Andy and John, so may I propose it, and right along with what you're saying, I will find out from them what was CDOT's rationale, weak
Criteria.
as it may have been. I think it was based on population and lane miles or VMT or something related to buses, which certainly benefited Denver because they have all the RTD, the light rail, that's all counted into this that nobody else does. So let me bring that back next month with that kind of information, something to support that we are 15% of the population. I know Andy has already said we're not going to limit ourselves to 9% for our priority projects. We're going to do 15%. Now, this is all going up to CDOT, and of course, they're going to then put together, if Denver Chamber of Commerce asks for transit projects to go in the ballot issue, this is where they're going to draw from, is off of our priority projects. We're certainly not going to get even 9%, all of our stuff funded, but they want to have enough on the ballot statewide to get enough voters, the majority of voters, to vote for the sales tax. So we'll bring that back next month, and then certainly there could be a recommendation for the priority projects, but then also a second recommendation, motion for the board to fight for more money, however we want to phrase that.
Throw the turd in the punch bowl and leave. Just saying. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions, comments, concerns for Ken? Okay. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Let's think about what makes sense for a resolution. There's lots of data out there with respect to the economic impact, our region, how it provides for the state. In general, we have a large percentage of the tourist attractions in the state. So I think that there's a lot of information out there we can use to make a really strong resolution.
We also have a very large employer, Fort Carson. Oh, who is that? I've never. Okay. So that would be something.
All right. Okay. Lost my agenda.
Could I ask one question?
Yes, ma'am.
You were saying the criteria they use is safety one? You know, like you pass and safety of traffic and so much traffic.
I don't know what criteria
I don't know
CDOT uses.
what it is, but that's a major thing in anything,
Right.
I would say.
Yeah. Ken, do you have any idea of CDOT's criteria for allocating? I know we've heard various pieces of information over the years.
The only two things that I remember being mentioned was population, and then something about transfer stations or crossing transit districts, within the region or something like that. And obviously, small communities don't have transfer points. They're all on one route, and they pay one thing to go across town. Colorado Springs, I think, has only 2 districts, and you only have to do this quote-unquote transfer. What's the right word for that? When you buy a ticket and you have to transfer from one part of town to another? Zone-based or something like that. And obviously, Denver has a lot of those, but there was no mention of safety.
One thing I'd just like to mention personally that I did in the year 2001, we've had some bad accidents coming out of Green Mountain Falls. And I wrote to CDOT and said, I think we need a stoplight, as you come out to go up to Woodland Park or something. They wrote back and said, there's not enough traffic. That was their answer. And I know in North Carolina, because I did some stuff like we're doing, they said our mission is to move traffic. Well, okay, but you have to factor in we've got more time than money. I mean, we don't have to be so fast maybe. That's just my opinion. I think safety is such an important thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Okay.
All right. Does anybody have any member announcements? No? And I'm sorry.
I'm just going to throw out there, I don't know how many folks live in District 11, certainly not our neighbors. But if anyone does, or if you want to help spread the word, District 11, this is not really a league thing, it's a District 11 thing. We are hiring a new superintendent, and we are interviewing 2 candidates on Friday evening at the Tesla Educational Center, starting at 6:30. So if anyone is interested in more details, let me know.
Thank you. Yes, Kim.
Well, I have something, I think. Might this be Kevin's last meeting?
Is it? Oh, it is May, isn't it? Sorry.
Yes. And so I would like to thank him for his service. I know we haven't seen the end of you. You'll be out there in plenty of places, but I sure appreciate his input and what he's done.
Yes. Thank you, Catherine. Sorry, I'm being remiss. And Anne, this is your first meeting, really. So why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself, please? Just short and sweet.
I'm 81 years old.
Awesome.
My great-grandfather built 2 places in Green Mountain Falls 102 years ago. So I spent all my summers here as a Kansan in the good old days, when Daddy earned all the money in the hot country and the mothers and children came. My husband is in the audience. He taught biology at Wake Forest University for 53 years and finally retired last May. So we're making our permanent home back where we grew up. We met at 61 years ago at Colorado College.
Oh,
and we're living in Woodland Park currently because our cabins in Green Mountain Falls are not winterized, and they're really old. And at our age, it's much more sensible for us to be in Woodland Park. But since we're interested and we own property in Green Mountain, and I care about the town and the pass and all of it, they asked me if I do that, and I said I would. So thank you very much.
Well, welcome.
Welcome.
Okay, next CAC meeting, do we have anything that we need to add or presentations anybody'd like to see?
Well, we got the resolution issue.
Well, yeah,
We've
well-
got that done.
Yes, John?
An update on the gap.
Update on the gap, I'll see what we can do.
The managed lane, that's the one you're talking about?
Tolls, we love tolls, right?
There is an interesting article in Colorado Politics today regarding the gap and endorsements.
And I have no idea if we have access to any sort of information about the Hyperloop, but I'll always ask about it.
Yeah, I've asked for an update
Got
on
the
that.
gap,
They- Yeah, we'll see if we can get them back too. I have asked on Hyperloop.
And I saw in our reading that there's plans for rock mitigation in 24 between Manitou Springs and Cascade, and those of us who drive that would really love more details as they're available. That impacts everyone, and especially those of us who try to schedule our trips with our tourist industry.
Excellent. Okay. Anything else? All right. Next meeting is June 27th, and unless anybody has anything else, we're adjourned. Thank you all.
Shoot an email to Jessica, and she'll keep track.
You have to do it. You don't have a budget.
I think it's all right.
Yeah, I can do that if I can get his. Can you share your get Sharon to take the board meeting on the 13th?
Can you give me the email?
So I'll let you coordinate that.
Plug in the information.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a card Yes, sir. I didn't bring it up.